Thank you very much. Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, so my talk today is called the Sonata of the Master Musician. And to really explain this subject, what I'd like to do is sort of give you a big picture of understanding how the esoteric philosophy, which is where I'm coming from, views creation and how it's related to sound. And then I'm going to take us down into looking at how it applies in the immediacy of your life, both in terms of how you interact with people in the world, but also the spiritual journey itself, your own journey. And it's really interesting because the subject of sound is actually fundamental to most theologies. You know, for instance, we're told in sort of the Western Judeo-Christian thinking that the whole nature of creation was initiated by the Word, as they say in the Christian philosophy. And in Eastern philosophy, we're told that Brahma sang the universe into existence. So we get that fundamental idea that at the very highest level there's a primordial sounding forth of the great one life, the single life, and it's responsible for the entire manifestation of all things, the great single creative effort. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about, or when I talk about, the master musician. See, in this philosophy, there's this idea that in the ultimate sense, there's only one thing. And that one thing is sometimes called God, Brahma, Vishnu, universal intelligence, Allah, it doesn't really matter. And that single life principle manifests itself as cosmos, as creation itself. So one of the big things to understand about this philosophy is the notion that it's not about the idea that it's God and creation. It's actually more God as creation. God as creation. And so that everything in creation, everything that you see, everything in this room, and yourself, were all emanations from the One. Now there's a lot of philosophic discussion about how does the one become the many. And that's a deep question. And someday, if you ever are interested, occasionally I'll do workshops on that subject and people walk away a little bit dazzled by it. But it is a mystery. How does the one become the many? But it's all based upon the idea that the one life is sounding its intention, sounding itself forth, and all things manifest from worlds to cultures, to you and I. Everything is a sounding forth, a sounding forth. And at our level, it plays itself out on many aspects of our life. For instance, how do you use sound in your day-to-day life? How do you use your voice? How do you use your presence? One of the things I'd like you to understand is the word sound itself, when discussed in this perspective, must be broadened to not just think of it as something that you hear. In the deeper sense, sound is all vibration. So in a sense, from the esoteric perspective, light is a manifestation of this great sounding forth. Anything that's vibrational is sounding forth, is a part of that great out-breath, that great sound. And as we know from quantum physics, there's nothing in the universe that isn't vibrating. There's nothing that is not vibrating. Everything is alive. That's another fundamental principle here. If it's all about the one becoming the many and chanting forth its note, then there's no place where life is not. That everything is alive. Even the chair you're sitting on, if we could analyze and understand the full nature at the subatomic level, if we could understand the atoms that go into that chair, we'd find that there's life there and it's sounding forth. It's sounding forth. So when you think about yourself and your own spiritual journey, think about how do you bring forth vibration into the outer world? And that happens on many levels. That happens when we think about the words we use. That happens by your mere presence. You know how people, everybody, every one of you has a presence about you. You're there, you're standing there, you're being, you're in a state of being, but you're radiating a quality. That's part of the sound. That's part of the sound. And so think about this idea of sound in all of those categories of your life experience, not just those sounds that you hear. And when you speak, when you're talking in the world, that's a great creative act. You know, it's very interesting when you think about the idea that public speakers, people that are really, they make their whole livelihood and their passion is to publicly speak, they understand the power of language, the power of language, and that it's more than words, that there's vibrational life in everything that is said. And there's a whole science to the use of words when trying to convey an idea. There's things like volume, cadence, tempo. All of these are variables that go into the full magnitude of what you put out in the world. And the big question is the full nature of your vibrations, your sounding forth, to what extent does it uplift? Because it's you know, I remember the old movie Star Wars, you know, they say the Force was neutral. It was how you used it, Luke, that defined whether it was going to be for the good or the ill. So it's, in many ways, the spiritual journey is learning how to understand how you are vibrationally affecting the field. And the field is every circumstance of your life. How well are you contributing to the upliftment of the field? Because you know, from this perspective, you are the soul. Your soul is actually guided by the need to serve. And it wants to serve by making an uplifting contribution to something beyond yourself. And there's the whole science that goes along with how do we do that? How do we bring forth the very best of us? Through language, through presence, through any creative act. Does it uplift? Does it uplift? Now, I don't know about how many of you are meditators, but once you're on the path and you start to meditate, there's this understanding that there's actually two parts of us. There's a higher self and a lower self. We call it the soul and the personality. And once you wake up to the fact that you have a soul, that you have a higher part of you that's been behind the scenes all along, and you become conscious of it, what you're really becoming conscious of is a higher note. You're becoming conscious of a higher note deep within you. And that note is very silent, or actually it's been called the voice of the silence. It's very quiet as compared to the note of the personality. For a long time, the only note that we sensed in ourselves was the note of our outer ego, the personality. But when you wake up, there's a sense of a higher vibration, a higher quality. And that's when the journey really begins. That's called the awakening in the spiritual tradition that I'm coming from. The awakening to your higher nature, the awakening to a higher note, and the increased commitment to try more and more to live according to that higher note. Now, what's interesting is that when the awakening occurs and you start to realize that you have a higher part of you, that note that is higher is very faint as compared to the dominant sound of the personality. But not only is it faint, but it's dissonant. It's dissonant as compared to that higher note. In other words, when you start on the path and you realize that you are actually expressing two notes, and that one's higher, one's loftier, one is seeming more spiritual and more loving, you realize that the day-to-day note that you've been living is in conflict with it, or is in dissonant with it vibrationally. And that stages the great journey to transform the lower so that it no longer is manifesting a dissonant note. and that it's being adjusted so that it becomes harmonic and integrated with that higher note that you've been sensing. In this philosophy, there's a process called soul infusion that I'd like to share with you. Soul infusion is this. I'd like to imagine that I've got a sphere here, and it's the soul, and it's sounding its note, it's sounding its quality. And imagine that down here I have a personality, and that's the note. And now I know I've got two notes here. Well, when you wake up to the two notes, they're still kind of apart, but you know they're both there, and they're dissonant. But slowly you're trying to infuse the soul into the personality and convince that personality to give up the directing of the orchestra and allow another director to guide the show, to guide the musical composition. And that's a gradual adjustment from a dissonant relationship between these two notes within you to a gradual process of harmonization. And when they're fully harmonized, that is to say they both are completely fused together, in the ancient esoteric literature that's called the transfiguration. That's when there's no longer any part of you that has a dissonant note to the higher part of you. It is in complete, it's a chord, a harmonic chord. So I'm using this kind of using sound to try to give you a sense of that process of bringing the two parts of you together and allowing the higher to move you forward. But also, as I said, when you're on the path and you're thinking about not only trying to live more that higher note, but you're also trying to, you get this sense that there's a need to go and do something to make the world a better place. So you're trying to be more expressive of that higher note. Now what's interesting about that is that in a way what you're trying to do is to learn how to sound your note out in the world, that higher note. Let me tell you a little story. As I was driving over here today thinking about this talk, I flashed on something that happened to me, a true story that really woke me up to this process of service on the behalf of the soul. Many years ago I was a student in this philosophy in California, and I was, for a variety of circumstances, I moved from California to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I know, it's a strange thought, isn't it? And I got to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I was still a student and I would travel back to California regularly. So I went to Pittsburgh, and I wasn't a teacher of this philosophy at all, but I was feeling that was coming, okay? And an interesting thing happened. I got to Pittsburgh, and my first impression of the city was like it was 10 or 15 years behind the times. And so I felt a little discouraged that somehow, even if I were to start putting myself out there, I would, it wouldn't catch, and people wouldn't resonate to it because they weren't ready for it, you know? So I was there for about a year, and then I went back to California to meet with my classmates, and a good friend of mine who was a classmate, her name was Rebecca, she came up to me and she said, "So William, how's it going in Pittsburgh? Have you got something going yet?" And I said, no. And she says, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, you know, the truth is I just don't think that Pittsburgh is the place to do it. I mean, it feels like they're 10 years behind the times." And she looked at me and she snarled and she said, "William, you've got to sound your note." That's a quote. "You've got to sound your note." And it took me back. I fell back, and it was such a hit of wake up to the fact that you can't really get out there and do some service in the world unless you are willing to take the risk and sound that higher note. And for me, it's a higher note that has to do with teaching, but for other people it might be, it can be whatever that higher note is. What is that higher note? It's another way of saying your gift. What is your gift? What is the best part of you? What is the thing in you that you feel if you could bring it more fully into the world, it would make a positive difference? It would make the world a better place. And that's your note. And I was afraid of bringing it forth. And I'm glad that she shook me up. She scolded me. And I went back to Pittsburgh and I said, okay. So then the next thing I did was I wrote an article. And it took a year, but it got published in a local magazine. And then it led to something else. And so I sounded my note initially by not speaking, but by writing. And then that led to other opportunities. The doors started to open. But you can't have the doors open unless you sound your note. You see? It was a big lesson for me. Big lesson for me. So I put it out to you. I mean, think about your own lives. How are you doing with the sounding of your note? Are you putting it out there? Are you moving forward with it? It's a big question. It's a big question. Because see, what happens is when you really when you sense those deeper qualities and you really say, I'm going to go with it, what happens is that lower note, that lower part of you, rises in opposition or finds clever ways of convincing you that its note is really the better note. Or that the ego is somehow your safe haven. So you get what is called the rising of the ancient fires, where there's a resisting force that will try to prevent you from sounding forth that higher note. Now and it could be fear, for instance. That could be part of the resisting force. But your lower self will assert itself at a certain point and try to prevent you from moving forward. And you see that not just as in the individual case, but you also see it sociologically. You see, because in this philosophy it's understood that it's not that just that you have a soul and a personality and they at times are struggling with each other, a higher note and a lower note. Social systems are living entities. Politics is alive. Business is alive. Science is alive. Religion is alive. And they too have a higher and lower nature. They have a higher note and a lower note. And look at the world today. The world, you know, I have a whole idea here that really, right now, humanity is awakening to its higher note. All of humanity is hearing a higher sense, a higher possibility. It's sensing a possibility that represents an understanding that we are truly all one. And that higher possibility is what is playing out in our world politics and our economics today. But that idea is interesting because as this higher possibility, the soul of humanity awakens, we see a resisting force rise to the surface. And so what have we seen the last few years? We've seen the worst of politics as well. We've seen the worst of economics. We've seen the worst of, religion for sure. We've seen the worst of that. And so this is another example of what I'm saying when I talk about how there's a resisting force that tries to prevent that higher note from coming into the game. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's really interesting in the ancient literature that lower resisting sound, you might say, it's called the ancient fires. The ancient fires. And that's an esoteric phrase for old ideas that have outlived their usefulness. Old ideas that have outlived their usefulness, and that's an old sound. That's an old way of being, and it resists the new. And that's where we're at today. We're trying to resonate to a higher note, and the ancient fires are rising in defiance. It's kind of interesting, because what is that higher note for all of humanity really about? It's about recognizing that we're all one. That's that's a fundamental principle here. It's about recognizing that egalitarianism is the way of the future. It's a note that's trying to say to us as a collective whole that diversity is the only way that we can realize our oneness. It's a note that's saying the environment, that everything is connected, and that everything that we do as a species is not separate from nature, but an integral part of nature, for the good or the ill. All of that is a higher set of values, a higher set of principles, a higher note, trying to penetrate, just trying to penetrate into the collective humanity. But what's so interesting about that is that as that happens, shadow issues, which are lower notes, rise out of fear. And that's what we've been seeing the last few years, a resistance in that sense. And it can be intimidating. It can be intimidating. Now, when we think about the idea of these notes being played out and the sound that is playing out for us, there's also, we can take it out further and we can see that if you think about your soul is a note, it's a set of divine qualities that are specially designed for you to express, but it's still a lesser note within a yet greater note. Because in this philosophy there's a principle called Hylozoism. It's a kind of a strange word, Hylozoism, which means that, I'll give you a simple definition. Every unit of life is a note within a larger unit of life, which is a larger, greater note. On and on and on and on, all the way up to the one life. And so, even though we say you have a higher note to express, that higher note is just one instrument within, you might say, a cosmic orchestra. A cosmic orchestra. So that's one of the things that you start to realize as you start to sense that higher part of you, that higher note, that higher quality, is you start to realize that you are a living unit within a vaster entity, and that the creative work you do in the world, that creative work is not you doing something. It's a larger living system. It's a larger note. It's a larger breath coming through you and not from you. So there's that sense of stepping away. It has been said that the magical process, which is the creative process, is a process of co-creation. To co-create, that it's not you that's doing it, it's that you are facilitating a greater sound working through you. So that's why there's an emphasis on more selflessness. If you're going to really live by that higher note, selflessness is the name of the game. Where the lower note, it prizes selfish action. I mean, if you want to know the difference between the higher and lower, and that's a good thing to consider within ourselves, is that the higher is governed by the principle of unity and oneness, and the lower is governed by the principle of separateness. And in fact, it not only recognizes separateness, but prizes its uniqueness. Prizes its uniqueness. These are some of the discernments that are important on the path. You know, it's really interesting. If you think about living your life and trying to evolve to your higher consciousness, what's one of the most important things to do is to ask yourself at any given moment, which one of me is speaking now? Which note am I playing out now? Instead of just saying, just going and doing, remember, we're dual. We're dual. We have a higher and a lower. Which voice are you listening to at any given moment? And that's not so easy, because sometimes they're muddled up. Sometimes they're entwined together. So what is the sound that really represents your higher nature? That's the question. And also think about this. It's not just the outer actions that represent vibration that have an effect, but inner actions too. Like, for instance, our thoughts. We're thinking, you're feeling. A thought is a thing, and it too has a vibration to it. And it too has a note or a quality associated with it. And even though you may not act on that thought, the very fact that you're thinking it has a vibrational effect in the mental plane. How's that note going? You know, we may outwardly look like we're doing very good things, but what's going on inside? What kind of subtler notes are being played in your mental body and your emotional body? These are questions to be asked. It's really an important process as we think about the journey. One of the key skills that we are given to understand in the ancient philosophy is the skill of right discernment. To discern what part of me is expressing this. What part of me is speaking to me now? So I actually invite you to think about that. Think about that seriously. Because once you start to realize that you can discern that higher and lower, once you start to realize that by committing to the higher, eventually the resistance of the lower will give way. Then you start to realize that you can be a tremendous change agent on behalf of humanity's betterment, on behalf of goodness. Indeed, you become an agent of will, love, and intelligence, and the power that you have to change the world is remarkable. So, I ask you again, have you sounded your note? Like my friend asked me, have you sounded your note? And at least an effort at it is important. I see a lot of people, I counsel a lot of people, and a lot of people, there's a subtle fear of sounding the note. But I think there's a need to step out on a limb and try. Now it could be, it doesn't mean that if you sound your note, it's necessarily going to take off. Your note might be, there may be needing to develop the skill to deliver it well. It might be that the note is very good. The sound that you want to bring out into the world is good, but the skill at delivery needs to be good, developed. So that's a possibility. It also can be that you come forth with your idea, your higher nature, and you find that the field itself, the environment, the population isn't ready yet for your note. That's a possibility too. I've known a lot of people with brilliant ideas that are really, really cutting-edge spiritual ideas, and yet it doesn't seem like humanity's quite ready for it. But nonetheless, you don't know that until you try, until you sound your note. And when you sound your note as a soul, and that personality, that lower note is blended with it, you end up having a harmonic chord running within you, and you have no opposition inside yourself. And when that happens, you start to feel that you are actually part of a larger symphony, the music of the spheres, the music of the solar system, and that you see yourself as a living, dynamic participant in a great creative drama that is cosmic in scope, and you have an enormously important role to play. And it's when that happens, you start to realize and sense the sonata of the master musician. And so, on that note, I will conclude. Thank you for coming.